And it's Friday night with Byline Times with me, Peter Jukes.
And me, Hardeep Matharu. And for the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't usually tell you. Well, coming up, the worst economic self-inflicted crisis in living memory as Trussonomics meets Tufton Street. A week after Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget statement, the pound has crashed, interest rates have shot up, the insurance market almost fell apart. Well, how did we get here?
Well, first we'll be hearing from the academic and economist Richard Murphy to get his take on this crisis of the government's own creation and whether it can now be rectified. Then we'll be joined on the blue sofa by Shahmir Sanni, a former whistleblower and now cultural activist who used to work within what is known as the Tufton Street network. Now, we'll be getting an insider's account from him on the murky world of think tanks.
And to discuss all this, as the Labour Party had its conference, Keir Starmer gave his speech, and Labour peaked up to 33% lead in the polls. Who better to talk to than the broadcaster Jemma Forte, who can explain to us why this particular crisis, this particular cataclysm, has cut through to ordinary voters.
But I think they know what I'm going to say, Peter, because I always say it.
But it's true, Hardeep.
It is true. It is true. We couldn't do this without you.
We couldn't do it without you.
Byline TV is your independent TV channel. So if you do like what we do, whether that's our live shows, our behind-the-scenes info with our producers, or our incisive analysis with experts, then you can join the Byline TV community by signing up today on our unique platform, Byline TV. So all you need to do is head over to byline.tv/join and join us.
And it's not only on byline.tv that we recommend that. You get the same benefits if you sign up, as some of you already have, many of you, on patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Byline TV. You can also sign up, if you're watching on YouTube now, a little green button in the top right-hand corner. And that will make you part of the community too. And there are also these great things called super chats that if you're burning to say something during the live broadcast, you can have a super chat and our producer, George, will relay your comments, if they're publishable, to us in the studio here. And there are many other benefits as well, aren't there, Hardeep?
There are so many. There's hundreds of hours of unique footage, including all of this year's Byline Festival. You get access to our new Byline TV podcast. And most importantly for tonight's purposes, you get to join us for our After Dark Q&A, which takes place every week after this live show ends. So if you sign up right now on byline.tv/join, you can put your questions to Peter and me in tonight's After Dark.
Well, we must mention too that this week we've had hundreds of members signing up thanks to an amazing documentary by John Sweeney called Compromat, which tells you really a lot of what you need to know about Vladimir Putin's hybrid warfare in the UK and Boris Johnson's relationship with a certain Baron Siberia. So if you sign up, you get to see that whole documentary for free too. And we'll have news of a possible sequel coming very soon. But, Hardeep, this week, and our front page, where we lead on a story we've been covering for 4 years. And the BBC, I notice, have started covering this week, and that's the story of the impact of Tufton Street.
Yes, I mean, it's been such a momentous week, and I have said that way too often on this show. I think this is about the 6th or 7th time in the past 2 months I've said this was a momentous week, but it really is. And this week, BylineTimes.com takes a deep dive through various stories around the Tufton Street network, some of the libertarian ideological motives behind Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, and we take a look at the cost of living crisis and how this is actually going to impact not only the super rich, but also the very wealthy. But just before we dive into a lot more on all of this with our guests, Peter, I want to ask you a few questions so we can all be on the same page. So to begin with, what and where is Tufton Street?
Well, Hardeep, 55 Tufton Street is a nice Georgian house, which is in the centre of Westminster, in the old bit of Westminster, around the House of Parliament and near Westminster Abbey, where, it's all old school stuff.
And what is located there?
Well, so this is the thing. Tufton Street was the centre of at least 9 think tanks, most of them devised over the last 20 years or so. And the thing about most think tanks, what think tanks are supposed to do is to transparently, openly encourage debate about government policy, do research papers. They're supposed to be a kind of beacon of enlightenment. But Tufton Street changed the reality of those think tanks. The thing is, if you look at the list of think tanks, and there's transparency indices there, they are opaquely funded. Nobody knows where their money is coming from. And the few insights we've had into this funding of a lot of those Tufton Street entities, not all in Tufton Street now, by the way, but that's where they started. And the key factor in them is the paying masters are hidden, and the ones that are revealed are people like big tobacco and oil companies. Clearly, it's not really a think tank, it's a lobbying organization.
So there's this notion of coming up with ideas to influence government policy, and we don't know where the money is coming from for these think tanks to be doing this. So what's the link, Peter, with the government of Liz Truss?
Well, the government of Liz Truss is almost completely dominated, Hardeep, by these think tanks. If you saw people coming out to defend the budget after its catastrophic reception last week and over the weekend, the key person was Mark Littwood, apparently an old friend of Liz Truss's, who is the director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. I mean, a lot of these think tanks receive money from America, and their ideology, if you're going to describe their ideology of the Tufton, is libertarian.
And by that we mean sort of, they believe in a small state, small government, they believe in low taxes, low regulation, a kind of Singapore on Thames.
Yeah, it's a zero government or minimal government, everything is free market. But I will say this, one of the connected institutes is called the Adam Smith Institute. Adam Smith inveighed about monopolies getting too close to government. And often, when we've seen the clients of these think tanks, they're big corporations, they don't represent the small businessman. And one thing is for sure, they get very, very close to government, which Adam Smith would have hated. And the final thing I must say about this, Hardeep, and this is what the last week has proven. For 10, 15, 20 years, these ideological organizations have said they're market fundamentalists, right? As the last week has proven, they have no idea about market fundamentals.
Well, Peter, we've already had our first super chat from number 3, who is asking, why aren't these obvious criminals being prosecuted? That is a very good question, and we'll be coming back to that later in the show, or maybe right now.
I can briefly answer. I mean, I think we might be talking about, we have to be careful. We don't know the criminal acts are being taken place here. And if people are talking about a proximity, for example, between certain hedge fund owners and members of the government, there are, and Forex trading, foreign exchange trading, there are very limited laws on this. There's no insider trading laws relates to foreign exchange. There's a market abuse law. So the problem is we're not alleging any criminal acts, but if you're saying unethical things, things which are bad for the body politic, they're bad for a sense of confidence in our government, we don't have the legislation. The one bit of legislation or a protocol, a guideline, was the ministerial code, which is supposed to stop ministers meeting with rich donors and having a conflict of interest or even an appearance of a conflict of interest. What's happened to the ministerial code, Hardeep?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we all unfortunately know the answer to it. But now let's hear from Richard Murphy, who'll be able to put the week's events into context, describe their impact, just how bad the effects are going to be, and also provide us with maybe potentially some solutions. Peter and I interviewed him earlier today. Here's what he had to say.
Richard, thanks for joining us on yet another momentous week. It doesn't stop, does it? So with your expertise, can you just pull back at the events of this week, run of the pound, what happened to bonds and interest rates, and just give us a measure how catastrophic this last week since the mini budget, Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, has been.
If I was to do what you just invited me to do, Peter, I could look at the fact that the pound has fallen by, well, where do you start measuring it? But by up to 10 cents, and it's wobbled by up to 4 cents in a day. The cost of government borrowing has gone up by a couple of percentage points, which is absolutely unprecedented. Never had that much of a change in so short a period of time before. Government bond prices have therefore collapsed because they run in the opposite way to the interest rate. And all of those things look pretty disastrous in their own right. But that just doesn't measure the scale of this crisis. Now, I've been around for a while, lived through a few crises. I can remember the 1970s. I did actually watch some of Dennis Healy's famous comments at that time. I, of course, lived through Black Wednesday and 2008, by 1987 as well. Look, this absolutely is on a different scale from any of those events, because this is, first of all, homemade. We made this crisis, or rather, Kwarteng and Truss made this crisis themselves. Nobody else has had another crisis like this in this last week. And what is more, it is of a different scale because it represents a massive lack of confidence by the UK financial markets in their own government. It's not just foreign markets who've lost confidence, it's UK markets that have completely lost confidence. And as a result, we're seeing the spread of this over an enormous scale incredibly quickly. We know that inflation could go up because the pound's gone down. We know that interest rates are going up and that mortgage rates for many households could be rising by £500 or more a month, which is just staggering and puts the energy crisis into almost insignificance for those who are going to be impacted. We know that that's going to have a massive effect on businesses because, of course, they're paying interest. We now know there's going to be a spillover into the rental income market because so many landlords have big mortgages on their properties, so they're going to be pushing rents up. The spread of this is quite extraordinary. Unless we get control of it, it's not just that we've got a temporary financial crisis now, we face a major economic crisis to come as well. So this makes all the rest look completely insignificant as far as I'm concerned.
And what is the solution? We've heard that the Bank of England has been buying up, was going to reduce its quantitative easing, which is kind of prints money. It had to reverse 65 billion it's going to spend to prop up, basically, government debt in the next few weeks. That's a short-term fix, isn't it? The people are talking, one way of balancing the books is to cut benefits and public services. Will any of this solve the problem? Or, as they promise, Truss and Kwarteng, lead to growth?
There's no prospect whatsoever of growth inside what Truss and Kwarteng have promised. Let's deal with that issue first of all. Why not? Well, first of all, because there is an crash in consumer confidence at the present, which is hardly surprising. We all faced bigger bills. Energy bills were going up anyway, and were enough to dampen most people's hopes for a good winter. But now we know that mortgage costs could go up, rent costs, all the other things I just mentioned, but inflation is likely to rise on food and other things as well. Well, that's going to mean that consumption isn't going to rise. No business is going to invest if they think consumers are not going to be buying. So that's the end of business investment. Brexit killed all prospect of an increase in exports as a consequence of the fall in the value of the pound. That used to be the saving grace of a fall in the value of the pound. Well, exports will go up because our products are cheaper. Yeah, but the paperwork is still there as an impediment to most businesses actually exporting anything, and they're not going to take that risk. So all we have left is government spending of the components of the equation that determines growth. The only thing left is government spending. And what we are hearing at the moment is the government plans to cut its expenditure, except on interest, of course, because they are letting that go up. The expenditure that will go down on the NHS, on education, on social care, and so much more. What is that going to mean? Well, it's actually bound to mean people are going to get pay rises vastly less than the rate of inflation. We also know benefits are already under threat, and so are pensions, and therefore they might not keep up. If households do not have as much income as they had a year ago, which is what government spending less on people's pay inevitably means they can't spend as much, or if they do, it's only on essentials. And as a result, we will not be recording real growth in the economy as a consequence. It's impossible on this strategy for that to happen. What is more, their plan for growth, which is to cut corporation tax and to cut tax on the high earners, well, there's plenty of academic evidence on this. I've been reading this stuff for many years. The most recent study is a wonderful one in 2020 from LSE, just crashes the idea that tax cuts for the rich make any benefit to the overall rate of growth in the economy. Nobody could find a hint of that. Corporation tax, again, nobody's ever found a hint that corporation tax cuts encourage growth. In fact, the opposite might be true. Rather bizarrely, if you actually increase corporation tax rates and increase the tax allowances for employing new people and investing, curiously, you give away more money to companies, and actually, bizarrely, you encourage growth by increasing the tax rate and the tax allowances at the same time. But what you definitely don't achieve is increasing growth by cutting corporation tax. So everything they've done will fail. What can we do about it? I spent last night having a head-scratching session with my mate Danny Blanchflower, who was, of course, once on the Monetary Policy Committee and is now Professor of Labour Economics at Dartmouth College in the USA. And we bashed through and we published a thread this morning, what we do about this. And we virtually challenge every one of the government's assumptions. The first thing to say is that the Bank of England has signalled that it's going to be selling bonds back into the market from November from former quantitative easing purchases. That's got to stop. Because at the moment, it still looks like the Bank of England is doing, on one hand, a bit of quantitative easing now to help out pension funds, and very soon plans to do quantitative tightening. Too many T's floating around this interview. But QT, as it's called, and QT is the reverse of QE. No, you can't do both. You can't say you're going to do both within a month of each other. So the markets need clear signals. Quantitative tightening has to go. We actually need a real solid bout of quantitative easing again. We're still going to be running the biggest deficit that any UK government has ever tried. It will be 200 billion or more. That's never been done without QE. In 2008 or 9 and 2020 and 21, QE always made up the difference. Danny and I think the government should issue an energy bond for 100 billion and have the Bank of England buy it back within a week or so. And why do that? Because that provides the support that's necessary to give households the support they need to get through the energy crisis. And it takes immediate pressure off the bond markets, who suddenly realize, oh, we're not going to be asked for over 200 billion next year. Therefore, the interest rate pressure upwards will be reduced. Therefore, the pressure on mortgage rates will be reduced. The pressure on rents will be reduced. The whole balance of payment situation should improve because there'll be stability as a result. And all of those things spread through. But we also need a package of support for government services as well. We have to have people able to afford to work for government services without being worn out. We have to have those people spending. That's the only place in which we can start the growth that this government is looking for. And to do that, we have to have tax increases. What tax increases? Well, look, put that 45% tax rate back in, leave corporation tax going up to 25%, add in some council tax charges, some higher rate bands on that. Why? Because, well, look, 20% of households who need no support whatsoever to pay their energy bills are nonetheless going to get it over this coming winter. They're called the wealthy. They're the people who've got money left over. We can recover that money by basically increasing council tax charges. If some elderly people are caught out in that, and there's always the argument, granny in a big old house is caught out, you let that roll over until, I'm afraid to say, and let's be blunt about it, granny dies and you settle the bill up then. That's all easy to manage. But that's the sort of thing we need to be doing now. Really big imaginative processes that put employment, the protection of people, the protection of pensions, the protection of services, and the protection of housing at the heart of government policy. And we abandon this idea that we're supporting the pound above all else. Sorry for a long diatribe, but we really need a change.
And Richard, the other thing that we've seen this week is finally some mainstream discussion of the ideology that is behind Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, and where these policies are essentially coming from. I mean, there was some Financial Times analysis today, which is quite extraordinary in that it suggested that the Conservatives are the most right-wing major political party in any developed nation, to the right of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the Republicans under Trump. We've also had, finally, some discussion with regards to the Tufton Street network of think tanks, the incubation of these very kind of extreme libertarian policies, low tax, low regulation, Singapore on Thames sort of plans for Britain. What do you make of how those various organizations and individuals have been behind this libertarian ideology now finally being put into place by Liz Truss?
I've engaged with these people for quite a long time. Mark Littlewood of the Institute of Economic Affairs and I have done the budget commentary on the Jeremy Vine show on BBC Radio 2 for, I think, about 12 years now. And some years that meant we met up several times a year. Yeah, I call him Comrade Littlewood, which I think he believes is a touch ironic. And I mean, being exposed to their thinking, I've been to some of their meetings, I've spoken at the IEA even. And frankly, there's a number of major concerns. One, we have literally not the faintest idea who funds them. Now, I think that matters because we need to know who is influencing British politics. I actually said this on Radio 2 this week. Yeah, we don't know who that is. That's not okay. The second problem we have is that these people are really promoting far right-wing, pro-market, fundamentalist ideologies. They are anti the state. Actually, they're anti our right to even choose what the state might do because they say the market must control all fundamental services. They hate the NHS. They hate the idea of social care being provided by the state. They hate the idea of old people's homes under state control. They hate the idea that most services are under any form of state control. Their model would be the Barnet Council that tried to outsource literally every service the council was responsible for. And they believe that profit drives every form of activity to achieve the best allocation in society. Look, that's absolutely nonsense. I run lots of companies. I understand how it works. I'm a chartered accountant. I've advised loads of people in this area. And real businesses are not motivated by profit the way they assume. None of these people have ever run a business, which I always find really ironic. I get put on the radio too as a lefty and have run real businesses. These right-wingers have never actually ever been near a real business or understood how it actually works. But what really disgusts me about their approach is that it is so ideological. They do not listen to the fact that people will not agree with them, do not agree with them. There is a closed-mindedness, and we're seeing that now from Kwarteng and Truss. You know, the Office for Budget Responsibility have offered to produce a report. They always offer to produce a report. It will be available by the 7th of October. And do you know what's going to happen? They're not going to publish it. They don't want to do it until November the 23rd. They don't want that examination. And that goes right back to the very core of what these think tanks are like. They do not want to be examined for what they're doing. They won't put their books and records and their funding on the public record. They won't tell us what they're about, who they're associated with. And Kwarteng and Truss really embody that idea. I remember a meeting I went to in about 2012, organised by the IEA in Parliament, when Liz Truss was, first of all, my local MP at the time, because I was living in southwest Norfolk at that moment. I now live in southeast Cambridgeshire, but I was literally in her constituency. She didn't want to know me about that. And I heard what they were joking about. And I was shocked, and it's never changed. It was all about what can we privatise next? What can we cut next? What can we get rid of next? This was the banter before the meeting started, but it reflected what they really felt. These people are out of touch with reality. And I think that was shown in that FT graph this morning. One of the second chart that they put into that article was how far disconnected the Tory party now is from its actual supporters in society. And there's no overlap. These people do not reflect conservative thinking. The one thing, in fact, they definitely aren't, it's conservative, because the Conservative Party in the UK has always survived by a pragmatic instinct of literally, we'll do whatever is necessary to govern and compromise to achieve it. These people are ideologues who don't care about compromise. They just want to push their ideas onto society. And the sooner we're rid of them, in my opinion, the better.
Richard, thank you so much, as ever, for your insights, particularly over these market fundamentalists who don't understand the fundamentals of the market. Let's speak to you again soon. Well, to talk some more about Tufton Street, we are very happy to be joined in the studio by Shahmir Sanni. Now, just to explain a little bit about the background, I first met Shahmir 4 years ago when, along with Chris Wiley and the Cambridge Analytica revelations, Shahmir bravely stepped forward and explained what had been going on in an aspect of the Vote Leave campaign, Believe. And thanks to his revelations, this was exposed and some massive overspending was revealed. Shahmir was a whistleblower, is now a fashion guru and consultant, has moved on, but did a great service, I believe, to the British public. And he then went to work in the Tufton Street network and give us some insights. But first, Shimmin, how you worked on the Believe campaign. What's that got to do with Tufton Street?
I think it's important for people to remember that the British political sphere is an extremely small sphere, and that there's a revolving door between Downing Street, public media and private media, and lobby groups and campaigns. So everyone that works for certain organizations in executive positions will eventually go to Downing Street. They'll eventually work as senior advisors, SPADs as they're called, and they'll also work for these lobby groups, and they'll be doing campaigns all over. So a lot of the people that worked on the Brexit referendum also happen to be working at the same time, for a lot of them, for organizations like the IEA, the TPA.
That's the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Taxpayers Alliance,
Yes.
two of the Tufton Street entities. We'll get to that in a moment.
Yes, these think tanks. They're not think tanks, they're just lobby groups.
And so because you were in that milieu, you could have arrived, because you did such great marketing and your social media sense, after the Vote Leave campaign ended, they kind of employed you.
Yeah, so after obviously the referendum ended, they all went back to their actual jobs. And then obviously there were several revolving doors open through which I went in one. And I started working at the Taxpayers Alliance as their digital campaign manager. Obviously, when I blew the whistle, they fired me. And then I sued them, and then I won. And in my lawsuit is where a lot of the revelations that we now know about these organizations, these lobby groups, came forward, because all of the kind of whatever you want to call it, what was mentioned in the lawsuit, they didn't contest any of it.
And there were 9 related entities.
Yeah, so a lot of people get, I want to be clear about what those 9 entities are. They're more and less than 9 entities, right? The reason why the 9 entities have come through and this conversation around the 9 entities is actually from my lawsuit.
Right.
Because I mentioned 9 organizations that were based at Tufton Street and some in their outlying areas, including the Institute of Economic Affairs. So these organizations are set up purely for the purpose of creating reports, contacting media organizations, and then getting those media organizations to parrot those reports as if they're fact, as if they're scientific almost, as if they're sound information in regards to topics from all the way from procurement to culture, to tax reform, to military reform, to university fees, every single policy that you can imagine, or every single thing that is involved in government is then discussed, or a report is created about these topics by these organizations, which are then fed into media organizations to disperse, and then also to politicians for them to parrot.
Right. And so it is an effective operation. I mean, you named some of the entities. We don't have to go through them all. We can look them up. Those 9 entities. Did you ever get a sense of what the financial model was for these groups? I mean, who pays for employing people like you and all these stuff? You don't have to name names, but was that obscure to you too?
I mean, I've been very clear about this, is that, I've mentioned this, and I've even emailed and reached out to media organizations when I first whistleblew, and when I was first fired and sued them and won, was, hey, why are you guys treating their reports as serious reports? They're not serious, because I've explained in my lawsuit that they're actually not from verified sources. What the process of a lot of these think tanks is, and they'll obviously deny this, they have denied this, my lawsuit proves otherwise, and I saw this myself, was a donor would come in, usually, nearly always, a Conservative Party donor, would come into one of these organizations, or the organizations which had good relationships with them, and say, hey, look, my farm, my business isn't making enough money on this, or they'd frame it in a more clever way. They'd be like, hey, look, I'm concerned about this tax.
For our industry.
For our industry, for the fishing industry, for whatever you want to call it, the warehousing industry, any industry, building industry, cement industry. It's affecting my industry, and I really want more information on this, and I would like you to do a report on it. Here's a £10,000 donation. And then by that report or that ask, within 3 months down the pipeline would be a report that was then then the media comms team would get on the phone and say, call up the BBC, call up ITV, call up all these radio channels, local radio channels, and say, hey, we have this amazing new report where this charity certified organization with this really great report, which we're based in Westminster, here it is. And this kind of repetition of media organizations not having anything to talk about in their daily news bites, going, damn, we've got a new report.
And it was extraordinary this week because for the first time, the BBC, well, to my knowledge, for the first time, the BBC News website, and I think one of its radio shows, ran a piece on the other black door that's been very influential in British politics for the last decade, i.e. 55 Tufton Street. And now a lot of us who've been talking about this for years, reporting on it, that it was a big moment because the BBC, has to be said, is one of those broadcasters that constantly invites people on from some of these think tanks without being clear that we don't know the funding of these organizations. Neither do we know the specific expertise at these organizations which have gone into these reports. But, I mean, when you were in that world, Shahmir, Tufton Street, Westminster, what are the sorts of things, again, we don't have to name names, but what are the sorts of sentiments that you would regularly hear about, I don't know, public services, class, that sort of thing, that people might, that it's important for people to be aware of, considering their influence?
Before I go on to that point, before I go on to that, I just want to quickly say the point that you just mentioned about who's funding them. And a lot of the times, that's what we say, right? Who funds you? It's almost become a meme in these organizations when people ask them who funds you. But what I remind people is that the only reason, well, not the only reason, but one of the clauses, or I don't know the correct term for it, in my lawsuit against these organizations was that Shahmir believes in the sanctity of democracy, and that's why he came forward. And so they basically kind of went, okay, we admit to wrongdoing. Sorry, I'm going to make the point around funding. Bear with me. Their point in that lawsuit was they admitted to all of these things, that they were working against democracy. They admitted to things like that they coordinate together in order to give messages to Downing Street. And the big part of the reason why they just sort of went, okay, fine, we admit to all of this, was because if they didn't, they'd have to reveal who their donors are. Right. So these people were willing, these organizations were willing to admit that they do not care for the sanctity of democracy. They were willing to admit that they coordinate disinformation, all because they wanted to protect their donors. And so this is actually a serious point, which is the reason why we don't know who funds them, because if we did, they would not have any role in public discourse.
The fact they hide it itself,
yes,
consistently hide it,
in itself,
is cause for public concern.
And they understand that the conversations that they're having in these places pertain to ideas that largely the British public at the time, 4 years ago, weren't primed to. Things like entirely defunding the NHS. But that back then, a ridiculous idea. Now, very much possible. Things like lowering taxes for the extreme wealthy and even the upper middle class in a way that would only benefit them. 5 years ago, ridiculous. Today, it's happening. Every single thing that we're seeing in terms of the economy now are products of these organizations campaigning for the last 2 decades, decade and a half, right? And these are the warnings that people have been giving is, why are these organizations campaigning so viciously for these free market ideas. But they're not free market ideas. They're actually radically obstinate and at times extremely stupid economic policies which seek to solely benefit certain individuals that have a vested interest in economic misfortune. You know?
Just before we close, I mean...
If that makes sense.
No, it does. It's very clear. Obviously, I have discussed with members of these 9 entities. They have denied some of these things. The court case is for everybody to read. You mentioned the media. Without opening old wounds or causing unnecessary grief, I think 2 of your fellow co-founders of the Believe Network, which was Believe part of Vote Leave, which was found to have illegally, unlawfully overspent in the EU referendum. One was Tom Harwood, another was Darren Grimes. As somebody who's a whistleblower who was, apart from being outed by Number 10 in the media and ignored, what do you make of the media's role in welcoming the think tanks and these kind of people as their front people?
To be honest, I don't have much respect for the British media. I think it's clear to me historically that the British media has always been slightly problematic. I think that the British media landscape in general is a circle jerk of people who have only their own ambitions in mind. I think it's quite telling that we're currently in a crisis of where half of this country's children, almost half of this country's children, are like broke. You have children starving in this country. You have people who can't afford their energy bills. You have people who are literally losing out on mortgages. Most people of my generation are not going to have a home in this country. And the fact that we have a media landscape here which kind of mollycoddles this kind of crisis is so telling. It's so telling. That of course they're going to platform people who have no intellectual vitality whatsoever. They're going to platform people who are merely mouthpieces for certain ideologies. They're going to platform people who conform to this circle jerk of ideas that have no basis in strong intellectual foundations. Look at the Prime Minister herself, Liz Truss, right? She says, we need to lower taxes, and if we raise taxes, there won't be any investment. This is like a 4th grade schooler, year 4 student, trying to understand economics going, okay, you lower taxes, increases investment. Increase taxes, lower investment. It's wrong. And the fact that journalists in this country can't even go to Liz Truss and be like, actually, higher taxes won't harm investment because investment in your company isn't taxed. It's such a simple idea, yet the entire Conservative Party government and all of these political commentators that are constantly platformed are repeating the same narrative because they understand, as do these lobby groups and organizations, that repeating the most idiotic narrative is what resonates in this country because the media has attacked this country to the point where nobody has any understanding of basic economic policy. It's a clusterfuck. Ooh, sorry.
You're allowed to say clusterfuck, Shahmir, particularly the struggles you've been through in the last 4 years. Shahmir, thankfully, has a great new career as a fashion consultant and has done, I think, our country great service.
And it's so funny because Shahmir has been warning for about the last 3 or 4 years.
5, I would say.
It's quite extreme, the sort of tendencies of some of these organisations and people, and that could come to Britain pretty soon. And I think
take over. He's warning they might take over.
But actually, from what you've experienced, you could see that it was coming.
Well, I said it because I had already heard these conversations.
Yeah.
I knew this would I hate being that person who's like, I told you so. I stopped doing that 3 years ago. It was part of my therapeutic work with my therapist. Was kind of going, these warning signs have been here, if not even before when I whistle blew, right? These ideas around lowering taxes until everyone is broke except the extreme wealthy. That was a deliberate, that's been there in public, that's what we talked about. It's what they were talking about in these organizations 5 years ago, was down with the NHS, down with the BBC, down with the Civil Service, get rid of all public organizations and leave it to the market. And this is such an outdated economic policy because all of these people, their economic understanding is entirely based on an Ayn Rand book or an Adam Smith book. Like they genuinely, even our politicians are so intellectually lacking. Britain's crisis isn't that, oh, everything's corrupt. Britain's crisis is that you do not have politicians and people in the media and in journalism who are actually smart. And this, people sort of be like, they're smart people. People genuinely do not understand economics in the media landscape. Or politicians don't either. The Prime Minister doesn't. And the reason why they get away with it is because journalists can't argue with politicians on basic things like lower taxes don't necessarily mean higher investment. Like it's extremely childish.
Well, thank you, Shahmir. And the proof of your assertion has been amply witnessed by the last week of catastrophe. But what are the public making of this? And where does this leave the political landscape, with the Tories suffering the worst poll deficit since the early 90s? Well, in a moment, we'll be joined by the broadcaster Jemma Forte to discuss how the public are seeing this. Before she joins us, let's go briefly with the columnist, the Guardian writer and campaigner Owen Jones to the Labour Party conference and our definitions of right and left. He had a very interesting conversation with the Labour MP, Jess Phillips.
Asking me about things I know nothing about.
Well, he just said we've got to finish the job and close the door on the hard left so they can never return. Is that very broad churchy?
Yeah, but, I mean, the reality is what you've got to shut the door on is the thing that didn't get us elected and caused absolute grief. The Labour Party conference is like really, really nice and friendly. You're here. You've been let in, Owen.
No, just about. 200,000 members have left.
It's not for me to say why people shouldn't. I'm not going to say that people have to stay in the Labour Party if they don't want
why
to.
Don't they
in
feel,
my constituency,
welcome?
all the same members are there. Like, what I hear being talked about here just doesn't marry up with the reality on the ground in my constituency.
But they've left. 200,000 people have left the Labour Party.
Well, then, others have joined. I have left and rejoined the Labour Party a number of times in my life. Like, I think that left-wing views are perfectly
welcome.
And also I think that loads of us have them and are painted as not having them by people who have their own agendas.
Well, that was quite the exchange. And now we're very pleased to be joined by Jemma Forte in the studio. Hi, Jemma.
Hello.
So let's start with Labour.
Yes.
Because according to one poll this week, it now has a 33-point lead over the Conservatives. And if that translates to the next general election, it would be sort of 400 seats in Parliament. The Conservatives would be wiped out.
It's a lovely thought.
Do you think, and we've had the Labour Party conference, Keir Starmer's speech was fairly well received. Is this sort of...
I think it's
kind of a done deal now.
No, I think it's really important not to get complacent because they've done so much good work. But of course, Liz Truss has almost gifted them the timing of their conference, for her to make these catastrophic decisions and then to have Keir Starmer talking, it just absolutely highlighted that he's sort of a sensible human being with a plan, with some policy. I think people have been crying out to know what do Labour stand for, what are they all about? He doesn't cut through. And then, of course, you just have this beautiful juxtaposition from sort of lunacy and sense. So it doesn't surprise me at all that right now they're polling I have so many people sometimes going, oh, but you're so dull. Great.
Yes. Can we have some more dull politics,
Absolutely
please?
Fantastic. You know what? If I want to be entertained, I'll go to the theatre. I'll go and see a comedian. Let's get back to competent government. I don't care what his personality is like. Just don't be corrupt. Don't be, insane. Dysfunctional.
Do you think that with the lead that Labour now has, we've obviously just seen this clip of Owen Jones with Jess Phillips.
Yes, I've seen
Do you think those conversations about, how left is the left wing of the Labour Party, etc., are those conversations now going to fade away? Or is it still about that dichotomy even within the Labour Party, the left and right of the Labour Party, just as it is with, the Conservatives, the right wing of the party, and the more centrist wing?
Yeah, you
of the party?
could call it like sort of extremes. Of course, the extremes on the right are running the show right now. Look, I'm a very pragmatic person. I just want these Tories out, quite frankly. I do have friends who are still grief-stricken that Corbyn didn't get in, if I'm honest. Because I have friends all over the political spectrum, and who, specifically, interestingly, people that work in the NHS, because they felt like his manifesto would have sorted it out. So I don't really have an answer for that. But my answer is, well, that's over. Get over it.
Also, we don't know, let's be fair. I mean, the one thing that was said that Keir Starmer, appealed to the Corbynite left and lied, right? But now they say he's going to the country as a Blairite. But the policies we've seen so far are to the left of Blair. We don't know what the policies, Keir Starmer's policies on the NHS are going to be, are they? He's talking about setting up a state-owned energy company, which is very kind of left-wing. So is there a little bit that he's been, they call him Dark Keith or whatever, that Starmer's being played his cards close to his chest, so the left might be surprised as well?
Yeah. I hope so. That's my hope. And I need some hope. I really do. And I think that he is this character who's probably had a very, very, very long-term strategy that at times has frustrated the hell out of me. I mean, I still disagree with not letting his politicians go down and support strike workers or whatever, but I think he has been just careful. After the annihilation in 2019, his only objective is to get in. And then once you're in, you're in. A bit like what Jess Phillips was trying to say in that interview with Owen Jones.
You need power to change things.
And Owen Jones said this thing that's very abstract, didn't he? He said that, so you're an abstract socialist, but it's very real, actually delivering things, children out of poverty, things like that.
We referenced this. Oh, Peter wanted to ask.
No, I'm just going to move on a little bit. It's just that this is us as experts. What do you think why is it cutting through to the public, who don't generally care about what Owen Jones and Jess Phillips thinks? They're not experts. They don't follow political debate. What's your sense beyond your political circle why Labour are between three polls, 30, 31 and 33?
I think people need to tangibly feel things that are relevant to them, and I think most people vote emotionally. So I also think that's absolutely fine. Most people aren't like us. We're weirdos. We're the ones who are like absolutely obsessed and looking at what everybody says. Most people have a sort of broad outline of what's going on. To a certain extent, they trust the grown-ups to be getting on with it, probably their first mistake. And they just get on with their lives, and they've got other jobs and other interests. So people vote emotionally. It's either how they were brought up, their blueprint, what they vaguely think Conservatives will offer, what they vaguely think Labour sort of means, and it's quite abstract. And so the example of this is that it's emotional, are the things that cut through. Boris Johnson did so many things that were deplorable, that were potentially corrupt. What cut through? You told us not to have a party. You had a party. That is bang out of order. I've had enough of you now. It really was that simple. The other day, we were a bit like, what is this? Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby, Q-barged. Do not do that. Like, British people are nice people, broadly speaking, and they have this sort of decency thing. And right now, Liz Truss has come in, and they're like, sorry, you've taken money away from us to give to the rich. It's very simple. Or that whole soundbite about millionaires get 55 grand. Sorry? Why? And that is cutting through.
There's such a gap, and we often talk about politicians and the gap between the reality of how everyday people live and then politicians' understanding of that. We referenced this earlier in the show, the Financial Times analysis today that showed the Conservative Party has gone so far to the right that its own voters are being left behind. And so, you might have voted for UKIP in the past or really believe in Brexit, but that doesn't mean you believe in very low taxes, very low regulation, and more benefits for the super rich. And I think that disconnection has been a big miscalculation politically.
And it's hitting your point. I mean, everybody's afraid about the cost of living crisis. They're lying about it being a 2,500 cap. It's per unit. We picked them up on that, and our poll indicates, an Omnisys poll, which Anna Biankov wrote about for Byline Times, that most people believe there is a cap. But now mortgage rates, rents, inflation, their pensions, and that's visceral, isn't it?
It is. Everybody is feeling this. And the fact that she didn't check it out with the OBR. You know, I think you listened to her being interviewed on those local radio stations yesterday. The woman can't string a sentence together. She doesn't understand her own policy. I think she still doesn't understand that she hasn't capped energy bills. Honestly.
Yeah, she's probably deluding herself.
I actually think that the comms are so bad, but it's her policy and she hasn't got a grip on it. And these people, you're right, you know, this isn't conservative. It isn't British. They're trying to sort of change sort of the whole phase, and we know why, because of everything you've been talking about in Tufton Street and all that kind of influence. So as you say, suddenly everybody I know, and like a couple that I know, very hardworking, you know, middle class, sort of just, you know, normal people, got a second baby on the way. They are so stressed because they've slightly maxed out on their mortgage and it is up. And suddenly they're like, whoa, 2 incomes, really hardworking, decent people, and they can't sleep.
Well, their mortgage could triple.
Yeah, and who has that in their back pocket? And so this all trickle-down rubbish, what a load of old rubbish. And if she says growth again, and to me it's like, stop saying that, please stop saying that.
Putin, it's his fault
that
we
Oh
have
my God,
crisis as we are now.
But whereas, why is the pound going down relative to all other currencies? You also have the energy crisis.
Yeah.
And also, you know, as the the OECD proved, we have the worst growth in the G7. And
Yes.
we'll hit it. So
exactly.
it ain't working.
Exactly. So this idea that people have got this sort of so this growth business, it's the opposite. I'm not an economist. I can work out that if everybody's feeling the pinch, and if people on my kind of income bracket are going to be going, oh, right, so no holiday this year. Yeah. You know,
that cuts through.
Or sorry, love.
No new car, no extension. No,
all of those things, all the fripperies as well will be going. I might not be able to have a blow dryer as often.
We can do it.
But it's a bit like Shahmir was just saying. He ended by saying that it's these simplistic messages that people who are in positions of power and these think tanks, that's what they use to communicate with the public over things like Brexit, etc. But here we have we have the reverse. We have a simplistic impact, i.e., everyone is saying, "Oh my God, everything's
what are you
expensive.
doing?
We can't pay our bills, mortgages." It's a simplicity of the damage of the impact, which has engaged everyone.
But she also doesn't even have that in her back pocket. So that is something that Boris Johnson did have. He could stand up and do that sort of quite impressive bluster, and people went, oh, she goes, deliver, deliver, deliver. And everyone's like, ooh, and it's...
That's a good impersonation. Jemma, thank you so much. We must get you back. As I've always said, haven't I? A young team on Byline Times, despairing over the last 4 years for good reasons. There's a great expression, truth is the daughter of time. And it all come out. So, and talk about things all coming out. This week, you may have heard, or if you haven't, you must watch it. Finally, after 1.5 long years, John Sweeney's documentary Compromat about Vladimir Putin, what he could have recorded, what his spies do in London, and Boris Johnson's relationship with a former KGB agent, Alexander Lebedev, and his son, Baron Siberia. That's come out. Here's a quick trial.
There's a sickness at the heart of our democracy. From crony contracts to foreign influence in our very own elections. An intelligence report suggests there's something even more insidious going on. The world of the Russian secret state is a world of intrigue, mystery, violence.
Alexei Navalny is said to be in a coma after a suspected poisoning.
A long history of Russian dissidents falling ill or dying from poison.
Russia does have a history of gathering information for future use against government opponents. They even have a word for that. They call it compromat.
Deep in the heart of Italy, there's a place where British power meets Russian money. A place where they say anything goes.
When people ask what happens there, it's probably easier if you answer what doesn't happen there. Rules that normally apply don't apply.
A place which holds a story I was told
There it is again.
not to tell.
Okay, close the door. Oh, it's a large black van, and it appears to be following us. And he's sat and waited, and now he's come back.
It's a bit odd.
What does all this have to do with British democracy? And what kind of threat are we under? That's what I'm here to find out. Right from the source.
So if you like what you have seen, just head over to byline.tv/compromat and sign up to watch the full documentary. If you use the discount Compromat, you'll get the first month of Byline TV for just £2. So do head over and do that. And if you'd like to join us for our After Dark Q&A, which starts in 5 minutes, byline.tv/join, and you can put your questions to me and Peter. But that's it. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope we've shed some light on the murky world of Tufton Street and how it's met Trussonomics. We'll be back next week, 7 p.m. Friday night with Byline Times. We'll see you then. Thank you.